So good afternoon, everyone. I think we can start. Welcome to this first strategic debate of 2019 with the topic breaking the barriers. So it's quite actually a challenging topic that we give ourselves, and we have chosen the topic actually because we know that 1 in 5 children between the ages of 6 and 17 is out of school, according to estimates from the UNESCO Institutes for Statistics. And furthermore, many of those who are in school are failing to learn the basics, with as many as 6 in 10 children in primary and lower secondary age not achieving minimum proficiency levels in mathematics and reading. So what will it take actually to remove all barriers and finally get all children and youth to learning? So we are shifting actually the focus from schooling to learning. And today's topic is 21st century children. What is the nature of modern childhood? And we are very glad and proud to have Tracy Burns with us, who will present the interrogations and the results from an ongoing research project at OECD's Center for Educational Research and Innovation, CERI, on the nature of the 21st century children. How has the changing environment of children affected their emotional well-being and their physical health? And what does that mean actually for teaching and learning? And what is it actually that we need to take into account when we prepare educational policies and educational plans? So of course, it's a topic that is very much of concern to us as educational planners. But let me first present Tracy. She is a senior analyst at the OECD CERI. And she leads a portfolio of projects, including innovative teaching for effective learning, 21st century children, that's the one she will be talking about, and trends shaping education. And until recently, she was also responsible for OECD's work on governing complex education systems. Before her time at the OECD, she worked on social determinants of health and well-being. So she has also quite some history on the topic. And as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of British Columbia, she led a research team in investigating newborn infants' responses to language. Tracy has a PhD in psychology from Northeastern University in the USA. And then we have with us Riel Miller. Riel is a colleague from UNESCO, where he is the leader at the Futures Literacy, Research, Policy and Foresight section in the social and human science sector. Before, he was head of foresight at the UNESCO Bureau of Strategic Planning, a faculty member at Sciences Po, teaching in the Masters of Public Affairs, and a principal administrator at the OECD Center for Educational Research and Innovation. So we have 2 former colleagues here sitting side by side and talking to each other. And I think it's a very nice coincidence that I was not planning for, but I found out. So we will have some 45 minutes of presentation from Tracy, and then Riel will lead us into the debate with some questions first to Tracy, and then with some interrogations I'm sure he has as a person who is very much concerned with trying to analyze the future and doing prospective analysis. So the floor is yours. And perhaps I should mention also that you are very much welcome actually to use Twitter and to post your tweets on hashtag strategic debates. We would be very happy to see what you are coming up with. Thank you very much. And please.
Thank you.
Tracy.
Thank you very much. I will stand because I like to wave my hands around when I talk. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I came not from the OECD headquarters, a 10-minute walk away. I came from Boulogne, which is where the education directorate is of the OECD. And it's always a great excuse to come on a sunny afternoon and have a little small walk in Paris. So as Michele said, I will present our work on 21st century children. It has three main questions, and I'll just go straight into them so that you can sort of see where we're coming. There are spaces up here, and I promise not to ask difficult questions of anybody who sits up here, so feel free. The work has three main questions. The first is, and yeah, Riel, if you want to move, what is the nature of childhood in the 21st century? And it's an honest question. Is it different? Is it the same? I mean, we talk a lot about it as if it's changed, but it's actually a question I think we need to ask. And then a question which is near and dear to the heart of a lot of educators, which is how can we protect and guide children while still allowing them to be children and learn by making mistakes? And this is something that in our modern world with preoccupations for safety, there's a lot of worry about the risk we allow children to take and how much risk is a possible risk, actually. And the third one is, of course, what does this mean for teaching and learning? The way we do this, and it's a very deliberate approach, we have two specific elements. One is that it's multidisciplinary. So I work in the Education Directorate, but here we are drawing on research from the physical sciences, from biology, from psychology, from mental health, many, many different disciplines, and also different policy traditions. And secondly, that it takes a lifespan approach, which is, for our purposes, looking at childhood 0 to 18. And this is something that in education we don't always do, because we have particular slots that children fit into, early childhood or K to 12 or tertiary. And then we think of them in that box as opposed to them as a person. And so what we wanted to do in this project was sort of turn the lens around a little bit and say, instead of saying, how is the child doing in terms of education, ask, how is education doing in terms of the child and the child's needs and the child's life? We chose four main themes of study. These themes actually came out of discussions with our countries, the OECD's 35 member countries, and they identified them as the themes that were most important to them. The four themes are physical health, things like play, eating habits, alcohol and drug consumption, and sleep. Emotional well-being, things around stress, depression, anxiety, socio-emotional skills, and suicide. Technology, looking at the digital divide, information is power, social networks, and also cyber risks. And lastly, families and peers, and thinking about changing values, diverse families, aging parents, and the role of peers. And so one of the things that I want to underline here before I go through my talk is that this is an OECD project, so it really looks at OECD countries. And so I count on you to be able to fill in some of the reality from the much broader UNESCO reality. And I acknowledge right away that this is very OECD-centric. So listen with those ears and please elaborate as you'd like to help expand it from a broader perspective. The objectives of the work, threefold. First is to identify the relevant research and think about what that means for education, research, and policy. Secondly, to get countries together to talk about it, to share their experiences, think about what works for them, but also think about what doesn't work. And that's sometimes very hard for countries to share their mistakes. It's actually a difficult thing for people to talk about. And lastly, identify the research gaps and where we don't know enough. And I actually think this is probably one of the most important things that this project can do, is identify what we don't know, because in the absence of knowledge, we sometimes like to fill in the blanks. And it's done with the best intentions. Of course, we care about children. We want them to be healthy and strong and happy. And so we are trying to do more and more for them, but it doesn't mean that we always follow what the research says. And to give you an example of that, I'm just going to tell you a little story about our modern world. And it's a story about technology and sleep, actually. And so here's this project called 21st Century Children. And here are 3 quotes from writings about the modern world. The first one says, "The complexity and rush of modern life is not only affecting adult sleeping patterns, but it's reflected in children." The second one says, "This is a sleepless age and more we're turning night into day." And the third one says, "The stress and strain of modern life necessitates increased brain activity. Insomnia, brain fatigue are products of the last few decades." Why do I have these things up here? Because this is a talk about the 21st century children, and every single one of these quotes came from the turn of the 20th century. So what I wanted to point out was that some of the things that we feel are so real because we are living it are actually things that have happened before. And many of our concerns about our children, motivated by the same pride and the same love and the same will to protect them, are exactly the same as they were before. And I think one of the things that we would like to do in our work and insist on doing in our work is going back to the research to understand what has changed and what has not changed. And one thing I think we can all agree on is that our love for children and our will to protect them has not changed. So the question then is, how much of the world has changed and what's different? And one of the examples I want to give you from research, still on this story of sleep and technology, is this is not a very pretty slide, sorry, but it's historical trends in sleep. And so here's the slide. It's actually from a meta-analysis which was published in the Journal of Pediatrics. And what it's looking at is sleep duration in minutes. And it's looking at a number, I think there were 37 different studies that they found. Yes, 32 sets of recommendations. These are recommendations for sleep by medical professionals from 1897 to 2010. And what they found, recommended is the empty circles and actual is the dark circles. What they found in the study was that the recommended sleep duration consistently exceeded actual duration by around 37 minutes. That part is kind of constant, actually, if you look. So there's something that was consistent, regardless of the actual amount of sleep. So it was like as if children always needed more sleep, regardless of how much they were actually getting. And what they say, and this is what I want to underline here, is that the rationale for these recommendations was really consistent across 100 years, that children were overtaxed by the stimulation of modern living. That stimulation was embodied in whatever technical avatar was important at the time, whether it was school or the radio or television or now the internet. And that was what made them very worried about brain structure and sleep of children. And so similarly striking, these authors say, is that all of these researchers who are doctors acknowledged that they didn't have any empirical evidence for their guidelines, but they still published them anyway. And I'm going to come back to this. I'm going to come back to this because this is one of the hot topics right now you will recognize in the amount of screen time children are allowed and should have. And this, you will see this, it's continuing. So this is my beginning of this. What I will say now in terms of getting on with the talk is just giving you a sense of how we work. Of course, we start with the research. We are not experts. I work in education. I am not an expert in sleep research. I'm not an expert in obesity research, certainly not an expert in mental health. And so we work with desk-based research, but we also work with researchers in those domains. We ask them for their help, and we ask them what they are sure they know and what they sure they don't know, actually. We also work with our countries. We have created a questionnaire that asks them about their practices. These are education ministries. We ask them in working with them in seminars. And what we do is we try and bring these several sources of information to a series of reports that we've published, and I'll end with those. So if you're interested, you can find them on our website. That really for us tries to do two things. It tries to understand what the state of the research is, ask what it means for education, and then also sort of take away the myth from, or the hype from the reality. Try and peel them apart and understand what we should care about and why. So just to remind you, 4 main themes: physical health, emotional well-being, technology, families and peers. What I'll do for the rest of my time is go through each one of these 4 in turn and just give you a lightning fast overview of what we have found in studying the research in those areas. As I said, all of this has been published, and I'll put up at the end the actual papers so you can look them up if you'd like. Turning then to physical health. This is a trend in physical health, and it's sort of the good news, bad news approach. The good news is that in OECD countries, young people tend to smoke less on average. They tend to drink less alcohol, and they also tend to consume more fruits and vegetables. On the bad news side, they tend to sleep less. They do tend to have a higher body weight, and they are less less active on average. Just to give you an example of data, here is obesity, overweight. These actually are not children, but it's a cool set of data, so I wanted to show it to you anyway. The data on children are similar. This is looking at across all of these OECD countries, and here's the OECD average, the percentage of the total population that is categorized as obese, overweight. And what you see here are the actual numbers for those countries, and then the averages, 1980, 1995, and the latest one. And so what you see is not only is the trend in the same direction for every single country, there is no exception, but the speed of change is increasing so that it's actually expected. Well, actually, they're hoping that it will level off soon, but it's not clear that it has. And for children, this is huge. This is immensely important. It's hard to understate the impact that these obesity figures have on children. Diseases like diabetes and cardiovascular diseases were once considered diseases of adults, and now you see them in children as young as 2. So this is a huge trend. And again, there is not an exception in the OECD countries. They all see it, even though, of course, some countries are still much lower than the average. Another example, this is child death. So this is accidental injury causing child deaths between 0 and 14. The bar, again, for OECD countries is all negative, so it has all decreased in this time. And you've got a very small decrease there to a larger decrease here, but the actual size is not as important, because if you start with a low number, the decrease might be small, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you had a worse reaction. So it's sort of just a relative change over time. But this very clearly shows things like insisting on car seats, safe play spaces, things like that. They make a difference in the health and mortality of children. And so these are all very positive things that we've seen and we've been able to identify in our research. So just 2 examples, and I will move now to the emotional well-being. Again, the overall view, sort of good news, bad news. The good news is that on average, we can come back to this if you want, but on average, there are decreasing levels of youth suicide. And I have those data, which I'll show you in a minute. The bad news is that there is, on average, increasing levels of pressure, anxiety, depression. And interestingly, there is also decreasing levels of average life satisfaction. So children are reporting that they are less satisfied with their lives in the last 10, 15 years. There doesn't seem to be much change in bullying and somatic complaint. If you have an upset stomach, if you feel a bit unhealthy. And again, that's an interesting bar because that's not what the media seems to highlight. So this is important for us to highlight and talk about what that actually means. Why do we care? Not only do we want our children to be happy and well-adjusted and feel good, but 1 in 2 adult mental health conditions begins in adolescence. And so it's really important to be able to follow and track and step in and give care to children or adolescents who are struggling in the early stages, which will help them much more later in their lives. So just a couple of the data points. These are teen suicides. This data is from the WHO. So they actually have an enormous data set. We just have the OECD countries here for the slide. But you can find all the countries that the WHO covers. And it's 15 to 19. And here are the data from 2000 and 2015. On average, it's decreasing. It's a bit of a mixed bag. In most countries, it's decreasing. The one really big exception is over here, which is New Zealand. And those are astonishing results, actually, in 15 years to see that kind of increase. And I talked to our New Zealand delegate to try and understand what was going on there, and she actually didn't have very good answers. I mean, they're very aware of it. It's something they talk about often. They have many policy initiatives, but they actually don't know what's driving it. So these are the results. We do not have data on children younger than 15. And that is something which is actually, we really want to get those data because it's very important and it's something that's in the news a lot right now. Another example of data, this is from our PISA test, the Program for International Student Assessment. This is a bit complicated, so it's just the amount of bullying that's being exposed. Higher numbers mean more bullying, less bullying. And essentially, you can see a very big difference in the amount of bullying that students, these are 15-year-olds, that they report having experienced in the previous month. And this is anything from feeling left out to being made fun of or physically threatened, having things taken away from you. It's a very broad definition of bullying. So those are the two examples I have from emotional well-being. So we move to technology. And of course, as you've probably noticed, I've separated these as if they are discrete categories, but they interlap all the time. And it becomes really clear when you get to technology because you actually start seeing the trends touching on each other, but for the purposes of our being able to understand them, we keep them separate. And again, we've done the same thing with the positive and the negative. So in the positive line, there has been much more increased access to technology, OECD countries, but many and most countries around the world. Technology is actually very useful in making friends. It used to be around 15 years ago, there was a worry that children who used a lot of technology would make fewer friends and that it would interfere with their making friends. But it turns out that now that technology is everywhere and everybody's online, it actually is kind of an extension of your friendship pool. So it's not either or, it's and, at least on a moderate level. It's also very, very interesting when you talk about children as content creators, not just passively watching or listening to YouTube videos or other things, but actively being empowered to create their own content, imagine their own futures, talk about their own lives. And that's something which is a huge difference, to be able to have this capacity to reach so many people in such a short period of time. And that's very clearly a positive. On the negative side, there is some very clear research, and I have these data about feeling bad when not connected. People start to feel uneasy if they're not connected. This is research on children, but I would argue actually that we might also ask adults how they feel when they don't have their telephone with them or other connections. It's a question for all of us, I think. Of course, also being online more means that you are more exposed to risks, and those risks are very serious and they're very well known. There's some very interesting work that has been done both at the OECD and in many other places to categorize the risks and try and identify them and think about the best way to sort of stop or manage risk, actually, which I'd be happy to talk about later. And then the negative downside is the second digital divide. So if you remember, the first point here was increased access. That was the first digital divide. Some people, some families had access to the internet and some did not. And the good news is that in many countries that divide has been narrowed. The bad news is that now there's a second digital divide, which is you might have access to it, but what are you doing with it? And we see, again, the difference between advantaged households and disadvantaged households. And that divide is actually growing. And so they're doing less with it. The skills are less. They're less empowered to do. They're less guided in what they can do. And so this is a really serious concern for equity purposes, that second digital divide. And then there's a big category here where we just don't know. Part of it's because technology moves really fast and it's really hard to do the research. Part of it is because we genuinely don't necessarily have a good sense of how you would do the research on this. And one of them is about the increased time spent online. I'll come back to this later, but we don't actually know moderate use. We don't know when does it become too much. We all have a feeling that, 10 hours a day is probably a bad thing, but at what point is it too much? And at what point should parents be worried? We don't know very much about young children. If you know Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, all of those apps and tools, you're theoretically supposed to be 13 to use them, theoretically. All you have to do when you sign on is say that you're 13 or use your parents' password. Or, we know very, very well that children as young as 8, 3, 5 are using those. And we don't know very much about the impacts on them. And lastly, the difference, much of the research, the sort of newer research on technology is still looking at Facebook. But technology moves so fast that now Facebook's, for grandparents. And so I've put Instagram and Snapchat there, but that's probably already going to be old by the time this gets published. So it's coming from a research perspective, it is inherently hard to do good research on this topic. And so the criticisms that I'm about to get into are accurate, but it's with a very sympathetic eye. It's not expecting the field to do more. It's asking the question of, what do we want to do about this? Because this is going to concern everyone, that technology is moving faster than most of our systems can handle. Just to give you some examples of the data, here are PISA data from 2012 and 2015. So it's only in 3 years, a super fast trend, looking at about when children use the internet when they were 6 years old or younger. In 2012, there were fewer of them than in 2015. So children are using it younger. We know that. The other thing is the disadvantage-advantage point. This is just a question in the PISA test that said, do you agree or disagree that the internet is a good source for obtaining information? And what you see consistently in every single country that's up there is that advantaged students were more likely to agree with that than disadvantaged students. And this is one example. There's a series of questions. It's very clear that the ability to use and understand the opportunities is broken down by a number of lines, including gender. Coming to this point about the connection between the themes, here's an obvious one between new technologies and emotional well-being. These are PISA 2015 data. Basically, these are the children who self-identified as extreme internet users. This is the percent, those are the countries. Extreme internet user in the PISA test is defined by children, well, 15-year-olds, outside of school who spend more than 6 hours a day online. And you have from almost 30% in Chile to a much lower percent in Korea and China. The average is 18.3%. This is self-report. So maybe they're exaggerating, we don't know. Maybe they're underestimating. Over 6 hours a day outside of school, online, on a school day. These are the percent of kids who say they feel bad if they're not connected. It's very variable, not much gender difference, mixed. And it's higher than extreme users, obviously, which means that most people, in fact, feel bad if they're not connected. I had to go somewhere the other day and I left my phone at home and I spent the whole time being like, oh, what if something happens? I'm not gonna be able to tell somebody. And I was like, who am I gonna tell? What's gonna happen? It's okay. You can go to the bakery without your phone. But I was really like, oh. And so, you know, we can worry about that, but I think we can also ask ourselves, how comfortable would we be putting our phone down and just wandering away? I think we might all rate pretty highly on that one. And just to hone in, this is the area where we really wanted to highlight the research gaps, because there's a lot we don't know. What we are concerned about, this is ourselves, our colleagues in other domains at the OECD, our science and technology colleagues, as well as our health colleagues, is this mismatch between what is happening in the public discourse and the media and the evidence available. There is not strong evidence that using social media, for example, causes depression or anxiety. There is evidence that they're related, but you don't know if one causes the other. And the effect could be the other way. You could use more social media because you're anxious and depressed, for example. This we need more research on. I'm not trying to say it's not important, but we need to be very careful how we report on it and how we want to operationalize it in schools and in families. We don't have almost any information on young children, not on what it does to their brains, not on what it does to their bodies, not on what it does for learning, both positive and negative, by the way. There's lots of great research on potential positives, but we don't know. We have a lot of correlational research. This is associated with this, but we don't actually know of what causes. We need longitudinal, robust data, but as I said, longitudinal data on technology is really hard because technology changes so fast. If you've started looking at 15 years ago, what would you even be studying? You wouldn't, was Facebook around? No, yeah. So I don't, it would be irrelevant now. So there is a real question about how you construct a research project that has a longitudinal component, which means that it's still relevant and comparable to a modern day. because technology is so fluid that it's actually not, that's a really serious issue. And then that's this point. We don't know much about the Internet of Things, the newest social media developments, peer-to-peer online activities. And again, for good or bad, we genuinely don't know. And when we report on this to our education colleagues, it's not very satisfying if you are a policymaker. You want an answer. I mean, you're worried. You want to know, and you want to do the best you can for the kids in your classrooms. But we feel that it's actually very important to say when we don't know. People can make their own choices based on that, but we have to acknowledge that we don't know. And then the last one that we look at is families and peers. This is the one we're still currently working on, so we don't have the neat slide that sort of goes plus and minus. But what is very clear is, of course, there's a progression along life from early childhood where you have this strong parent-child attachment, and a strong version of that is associated with positive physical, social, and emotional development. Middle childhood, you start seeing the increasing importance of peers. 3 years, when kids start going to school and hanging out with more peers, you see their importance, but the family is, of course, more central. And then in adolescence, the peers become really, really important, and in fact, sometimes more powerful as immediate influencers than family. But at the end of the day, family is still important. One of the things we're very interested in is sort of modern parenting styles. This is the connection between parenting and technology. There isn't very much research, so this is just kind of an overview. Helicopter parenting. You know what that is? It appeared in the 1960s, but is really emerging more and more now. There is research on it, what it's associated with in terms of child outcomes and self-esteem and confidence and school outcomes since 2004. So we'll be doing some publishing on that. There's tiger parenting, which is kind of a version of this, more recent and more connected to some elements. So there's a lot. It's much harder to get good research on this. And we're doing more work now on this and these questions. I'm not sure these terms are going to stick, but the concepts you can understand. Phubbing, so when you're actually on your phone instead of taking care of your child. And sharenting, which is when you post pictures of your child on the internet, right? So 2 things about this. So you can see by when they emerged by the research, I don't have a lot to say because it's all new. But that's not going to stop me from saying a few things. First, phubbing. One of the things to be really worried about here is going back to that second digital divide. It seems very clear from the research that's there that the parents who are most likely to be on their phones during dinner or at the playground or out for a walk are parents who are less advantaged, who have less access to cultural activities, who are busy doing other things, who maybe don't have time to sit and work and have a nice face-to-face conversation over a dinner. And that is going to cause the second digital divide to be even bigger and is very concerning. And the sharenting one, oversharing about your children on social media, it might sound like fun, but we had some experts come to an expert meeting and their work was on adolescent identity. And when you're an adolescent, that's when you define yourself. You get to say who you are. And for many of us, or at least people my age, you got to do that. If you lived in a small town, maybe everybody knew who you were, but you could go to a big city and redefine yourself if you wanted to. You could imagine something new and you could start a new story. Or you could at least really decide who you were and go with it. But if you think about kids today, they have a digital imprint, which is in their name, which is their real name for most of them, from perhaps before they were born. And they were never asked if they wanted that super cute picture of them with the funny little face and pie all over their face posed. They were never asked if it was okay to show them with all their friends when they were 5 years old. And this is a difficult conversation. I'm not saying it's not okay to do that. But I am saying that if you think about it from the child's perspective of who I am, I'm 10 years old, I want to invent who I am. There's a whole history which you didn't create. Or you created, of course, but you didn't decide what went on there. And that's a very different thing. And I think one of the things that I find most interesting in this research is really that question about identity in a digital age. And what does permission mean? You know, obviously, if you're, our Canadian delegate said, I feel I'm really worried now. I'm not worried about sharenting. I'm worried about grand sharenting because he puts pictures of his grandchildren all over the internet. And I mean, I think these are good questions. We don't have any answers right now. One thing we do have an answer on is sort of the ubiquity of some of these things. I talked about helicopter parenting being the most common one and the longest one of this. And I thought when we first started working on this, I'm from Canada, I thought, well, maybe it's sort of, from my cultural background, maybe this is just one of the terms we use in my country. And so I just asked my team, I said, well, where are you from? Hungary, Sweden, different places. Do you have a term? And they're like, oh yeah, we have a term. And so I said, okay, I'm going to put up a Word document on our shared drive, and can you just enter your terms? And they did. There's 4 people, they did. And then later in the afternoon, I opened the document, and there was like 15 different terms because they had sent it to other people from other countries. And within, I think, 12 hours, we had this, and we had this. And in fact, we stopped because I can't get any more on the slide, but on the slides. But effectively, except for one Greek colleague who claimed that helicopter parents in Greece are just called Greek parents, every single language had a term, even if it was just a version of helicopter parenting, which was an Anglicism. And the Turks debated because they felt that Turkish mothers would be just as likely to be hovering over their children as Greek mothers, but in fact, they have a term in Turkey. So they debated it. But so only to say that this is something obviously that resonates with many, many countries in the OECD and externally, and I'm sure it would be interesting to know how much we can extend this list. So just to finish off with one more data slide on the importance of peers. This is some more PISA data, and this is just 15-year-olds talking about how happy they are with their life, how satisfied with their life they are. This is the change, whether or not they hang out with their friends after school. So the thing to notice is, except for this small non-significant result here in French Belgium, the rest of it is all positive. So they report being happier if they hang out with their friends after school, which sounds reasonable. And you've got a high up here in Russia to the OECD average here, and then all the way down at the bottom there. But so we know this in a way, this is just the data, but you have friends, you feel good about yourself, you feel more inclined to go to school, and you feel happier at school. And we know that that is associated with strong learning and good learning. So now we come to the delicate point in the conversation where people always say, well, what does this mean for education? And we're getting there in our work. We created a policy questionnaire where we wanted to ask ministries, what are you doing about this? I mean, we can tell you all these results, and we know that this actually goes hand in hand with a huge push to thinking about 21st century skills. We know that it goes hand in hand to thinking more about modern education where everybody's involved in the classroom, not just the teacher who closes the door, but the community is involved in a broader discussion. But then there's a real question of, well, how are you going to make this happen? Because there's a lot of people involved in all these special areas, and teachers are very busy people. They are not experts in sleep. They are not alcohol and drug counselors. They are not, individuals might be, but they're not necessarily trained for that. And I think there's a really serious question about when we want to deliver this kind of holistic well-being for kids, and one of the main vehicles is schools, there's a question about, well, how are we going to make that possible? How are we going to support the schools, the teachers, the parents, the principals? And so we wanted to ask our countries what they were doing in all of the 4 areas, and if they had examples of what they considered a real success, what they were proud of. We also really took a closer look at partnerships and teacher education and training. The survey is actually closing tomorrow, so it's not finalized yet, so I don't have any results to show you. But what we wanted to do was what I want to do is just give you a little bit of a sneak preview of what some of the main challenges that are coming out. And the first one is the biggest challenge, is I alluded it to at the beginning of my talk, which is this is a very holistic view of childhood and understanding the whole of a child. And I think many people resonate with that. It's important. They understand that children are not just grades and mathematicians. I mean, they're people who we have to think about their well-being in a very broad way. But education has very compartmentalized structures. And it's not clear who is responsible at what point and who should be responsible at what point, because there's a real issue around how we want to deliver the service and how we want to make it work really, really well. In terms of what is the content of what we're going to teach, we talk about things like digital literacy or health literacy. I mean, these are sort of new concepts of this is what you need to know to do very well in these domains. And they're very important to get right. We have to understand them in a nuanced way. It can't be just a very traditional, very simple way of thinking about these things. But then how do you connect them to measurement and accountability measures? Maybe you don't want to. That's also fine. But then, at least in OECD countries, there's a real question about what is valued and how you value things that you can't test. And that's a whole other topic for discussion that I'd be happy to pick up on. Third one is the importance of aligning the system and really thinking about if we want teachers to play a role in these things, then we need to support them. We need to actually ask them what they need and how we can help them. And that means also we need to help the teacher educators, because they didn't grow up being perfect at Snapchat. And if they need to think about digital risks and awareness to help the teachers, then we need to think about who's training those trainers of teachers. And so it cascades all the way down the system. And the other one here, of course, is thinking about what that means in reality. And here I'm going to use the technology piece again to talk about partnerships and governance and regulation. So we asked about partnerships. Do you have partnerships with mental health? Do you have partnerships with parents? Most systems did. Do you have partnerships with mental health experts, physical health experts, dentists, doctors, guidance counselors? I mean, whatever. We had many systems, quite a bit of variations, but more or less doing okay until we got to more of the cyber things. Do you have partnerships with cybersecurity experts? Do you have partnerships with law enforcement or any kind of policing that might understand what you would do if there was hacking? I mean, right now in our classrooms, we have data that is coming from almost every single exercise that a child will do on a computer. That's just what comes of doing work on a computer. And schools, of course, are charged with protecting that data. But they're not cybersecurity experts, and I don't think it's reasonable to expect them to become cybersecurity experts. And so we have a question in thinking about how we want to support those partnerships, who's responsible, how you keep abreast of the change, because even if you give all your school principals training, in 1 or 2 years, technology will have changed so much that unless you're constantly training them, which I would argue is not actually feasible, it's not a long-lasting solution. So you actually need to partner with the people who know and who are constantly updating, because that's their profession. But then you have all kinds of questions about ownership and proprietary information, and that's also another thing that we can discuss. That means something for governance too, because by the way, there is a lot of international work on this. There are people who know much more than I do who are working on the governance of risks and thinking about international treaties and protection of children online. But those mechanisms move very slowly, and we know that technology doesn't. And so there's always a game of catch-up for any kind of governance issue, and the same with regulation. And so I think these are fundamental questions, not just for education, but from an education perspective, I think education needs to really think and address those issues. And lastly, just to end, we have a couple of lovely initiatives and promising practices just in not in technology. We're still going through the data. I'm sure we will find some in technology, but just to give you a couple of tastes of things. In Japan, for example, in big cities, they have farmers that come to the schools and talk about their jobs, talk about being a farmer. In downtown Tokyo, where a lot of those kids don't get a lot of access to farms. And just that. I mean, it seems very simple, but actually, what a great way to make that connection and to actually think about the physical health and real world that connection of your kids. And they were proud of that. They shared that with us. In New Zealand, the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Education are working together in a set of pilot schools to really work on mental health, to really tackle mental health, particularly in their Maori and Pacific Islander population, and trying to really understand how do we support these kids from the youngest age, because they already know who is most at risk. And then in Canada, my country, and in fact, Riel's country, there's really a lot of work in the province of New Brunswick to really rethink integrated service delivery, which is something we've been talking about for 30 years, and which we can routinely say doesn't always work very well. And so really trying to rethink that and challenge themselves to do it well. So I will end there. As I promised, I will show you the working papers that give the reviews of the literature we've done thus far. We've done one on physical health, emotional well-being, new technologies, and we have just published one on the impacts of technology on children, on the neuroscience and physical, biological. The bottom line is we don't know a lot, but it's a really fascinating review of the literature. We're doing the family and peers now. We are analyzing the questionnaire, and we'll hope to have those answers for you soon. And we'll continue. We're publishing something in the summer, which looks at the intersection between technology and emotional well-being. And we'll be continuing to work with our experts and our conferences in our countries, because we want to keep pushing this and keep asking the hard questions. So I will stop there, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Tracy, for a very clear and very timely presentation at the point in time where we really wonder about school systems and schools, how they adapt to the children, and not the other way around. And I think that there are quite a number of challenges out there, both to systems and schools and also teachers. So I think we have to look at these things, of course, at a multi-level perspective. Riel, would you like to take the floor and be the discussant?
Thank you very much. Great pleasure to be here. Thank you to the IIEP, and thank you very much, Tracy, for a fascinating presentation of a critical issue. Absolutely. Central, obviously, because children are central. It provokes a lot of thoughts in my mind about the way we frame these issues. And I think the terminology we use, and even the perspective we have on it. So, and I just wonder, extending the idea of helicopter parenting, which I take to mean hovering and being able to monitor and be sure of the safety of children. I wonder if we're not doing helicopter policy. And worrying to a certain extent about being in control and knowing and being able to ensure coherence and rationality and evidence and real time. And when you put forward the quotes from the turn of the century, when electricity was becoming generally accessible, and therefore day and night were becoming merged, because all of a sudden at night you could be like in the day. Are we really undergoing as significant a change now as we were then? And to what extent did the need for policy to determine what was, good and bad, what's harming us, what's hurting us, how much does, this imperative that we're experiencing to just extend it a little bit more to the psychological and the health and well-being, isn't that in some sense creating an ambience of anxiety? And should we be surprised if children are, find that contagious, and that the anxiety of the helicopter state and the anxiety of the helicopter policymaker and the anxiety of control and in trying to let's get rid of that uncertainty. We can't have that. Maybe all that safety is part of the neurosis, psychosis, destructiveness. Just a thought to see if you can rebound on that one.
We've actually thought about this a lot. And for physical health, I mean, one of the really fascinating experts we had at one of our meetings is somebody who actually works on trying to make play spaces less safe. Not because she doesn't care about children, she has 3 children, but in North America, which is where she's from, the push has gone in her mind. She's a population scientist and a health professional. Too far. That things have become so safe that kids actually don't really know what to do if they fall down. I mean, they still fall down, but they don't scrape their knees the same way. They don't fall off a bike. I mean, there's less chance to have accidental injury, which I put up earlier. Of course, that's a good thing. But then there's a line of, well, what do you do when you don't ever experience a problem? And what do you do if you've never seen a little friend crying before because they hurt themselves? I mean, what does that mean for sort of understanding what to do in those situations? And so she does really great research, not trying to advocate for, throwing children back into some sort of early 20th century state where there was all kinds of dangers, but trying to think about where you might want to add a little bit more risk in their lives to allow kids to make mistakes, in fact, and to allow them to experience a little bit of disappointment. And I think that she's onto something, but I understand at the same time that it's super difficult. And from a policy perspective, you will never, ever win an election by saying, let's let kids get hurt more often. I mean, this is not a way to go. And so in some ways, it's very hard to come back from that position. And actually, I'll just give you one last piece of her argument, which is she works with parents and she asks parents, what are you most worried about your kids? What are you most afraid about? And the first answer was, well, actually, maybe I can ask you, what would you think would be the thing that parent would be most worried about their child? Sorry? Health? Okay, a specific example. So exactly, physical health. What might happen to your kid? Okay, you're more conservative. So the first thing that these parents said was they were really worried about their child being kidnapped, actually, that somebody would come up in a van and take them away, because that's terrifying, in fact. I mean, it is, right? That's everyone's worst nightmare. The chances of that happening are extremely remote, but they were worried about it. The second thing was that they would be seriously hurt and they would not be there and they would not be able to help them. But the third biggest thing that they were most afraid of was being judged as a bad parent by the other parents and having social media like, well, I'm calling the police because you didn't. And this is a very weird thing because it's very easy to say we need to push back. I can't change policy, but I can change my own family. And then you have this pressure from yourself and from your peers, which is a whole different world. So I find this super fascinating, actually. It's not my area of expertise, but I think there's something which is really important. And I think one of the things we need to do is talk about it more and talk about it honestly.
Thank you. So just to go a little bit further, so let me riff off that and kind of push it a little bit further. I mean, so let's take it to the broader picture of development. Let's take it to the broader picture of climate change. Let's take it to the broader picture that, the way we treat children is not something isolated from the rest of what we do, that it's part of the way we exist in the current world. And it seems to me that having been at the OECD for a long time myself, and now at UNESCO, and having been a civil servant for a long time, one of the big questions is about the fundamental ambition, the desire, the drive. And it's not just the question of rationality and coherence and making sure that things fit and that we've done the best that we can to ensure that we know what we're doing and that everything is under control. But it's more than that. I think it has to do with this issue of our relationship to the world around us at a very basic level. In other words, what I see, and I do work on the future, is that we're fundamentally at odds with the universe. meaning we're really in a very bad position with respect to the world around us, that the anticipatory systems, and this goes for children as much, and their parents, the anticipatory systems we use because we're not very aware of them and because we don't try and elaborate them, result in essentially a form of pain and cognitive dissonance that is very profound. Meaning we're trying to control the world, we're trying to colonize tomorrow, we're trying to make sure that the safety, and for me, safety wouldn't even be a physical thing. There's a really big difference if in your mind you're ready to take a risk. In other words, it's a mental attitude. And it's a question of experimentation. It's a question of exploration. It's a question of the way responsibility is allocated in your own thinking about your identity and who you are. In quite a few cultures, responsibility is not ex ante. It's not designated in advance. You will be responsible for this. Call the fire department when this happens. You're responsible when it happens because it's happening here and now. And you are enabled in such a way that you look for something that's relevant in the context that you're in. In other words, it's spontaneous. It's not prepared. It's not planned. And it's, you know, the whole discourse and framework that we're using, and it's not to be critical of you know, the rigor and diligence and transparency of what you're doing is outstanding, but it's part and parcel of what seems to me, and this is some of the work that we're doing on something called futures literacy, that calls into question, in some senses, the entire framework of preparation and planning. If we really take seriously the capability approach, the sen no spam, that capacity is the key issue. You can do all sorts of wild things and destructive things and terrible things with capacity. If I know how to read and write, I can, you know, do poetry or I can make war. If I'm capable of reacting not according to plan, but on the basis of what's actually happening and taking advantage of it, I'll do something completely different than what I had in mind because I'm stuck to my plan and I'm anxious because, oh dear, I wasn't sufficiently prescient. I wasn't sufficiently well prepared in order to do what I was supposed to do. So I don't see the obvious that's right there in front of me because I've lost my connection to complex emergent reality and I've swallowed the myth that we can actually play God, that we can determine the future, we can know the future, we can prepare for the future, we can plan for the future. And so this comes back to something really basic. Why aren't we playing more? Why aren't we all playing more? And Tracy said, yeah, that's what Piaget said. And yeah, that's right. Because if you look at what goes on, you look what happens when we play, we learn. We know that play is emergent. I do lots of games with people thinking about the future. And there's something fascinating about when you play, when you give people playing cards, because most of us have been socially conditioned to accept that a playing card is an arbitrary choice. We don't fight it. We accept it. And then we play with it. Then we try and do all sorts of wild and crazy things. Okay. But that's because it's play. And that gives us permission. And so much of what we're talking about, so much what we do, so much about education, so much about preparation for the job market, for climate change, for 21st century skills, so much of that preparation, the 21st century skills approach does move towards a more capability and competency-based approach. But the issue becomes, you are what you eat, the medium is the message, and the way that we instill these competencies, even if it's playing within the four walls of the school and not simply just listening to the teacher, even if you're playing within the four walls, you're still obeying the law that requires that as a child, it's compulsory, you go to the school, and you're still obeying a rule that's very convenient for your parents who go to work, and you're still fitting in to the show up on time, follow the rules, interact with strangers, rules of the factory or the office. And so we have to, I think, begin to really open up our thinking about not just children, but how, you know, the child within us has been, in some senses, completely eliminated. Because, and I'll end on this. So the children, my children, the children of my are now having their children. So I'm just about in grandfather range. And so it's nice to see. But, you know, what you see with little kids, I mean, you know, 1 to 5, 4, 5, is that they're testing their brain. I mean, they're not doing it. Does this work? Oh, that works. But then they forget. And then they have to do it again. And then the circuit done. And they're testing and they're testing. But they're experimental. And we know this from the literature and from the cognitive stuff. Experimentation gets somehow diminishes after age, 7, 8, something like that. Come on. We live in this unbelievably rich universe, which is experimenting, not because we're so, you know, brilliant or we're creating, because these experiments just happen all the time. And what's our capacity to appreciate that experimentation, to sense and make sense of that experimentation? And it seems to me that these are some of the issues that if we're going to open ourselves to questioning what is the nature of childhood, which was your opening point, that we really need to you know, push past helicopter policy to the bigger kinds of questions. Not that it's irrelevant, but it's what's the relationship, and are we ignoring one at the expense of the other, and what's the relationship between the two? So that would be my little comment on kind of using the future to think about childhood.
Yeah, thank you, Real. I think it's an important point, actually, questions a little bit how we deal with uncertainty, yeah? And what is it that we can do when we try to plan, and can we really plan, and how should we plan? I think it's a very crucial question, of course, to our institute. Huh? Thank you, both of you, for the presentations. I think we can open up the floor now for a series of questions or comments to both our speakers, and I would suggest that we take 3 in a row. Please present yourselves, give your affiliation, and then your question. And then we will have also some questions from our online community later on. So who would like to ask some questions? We have Hugo. Who else? Yeah, please. You can, of course, speak in English and in French. Huh? S'il vous plaît. And who else? Do we have a third question? No, but then we go with 2 for the time being. Hugues, si tu veux prendre la parole.
Thank you for the presentation. It was really very interesting to see how we want to take into consideration what changes into the definition of child in the 21st century with the overall social changes and technological change. I have a question which is, it also relates to what you defined as new challenges, let's say, for children in the 21st century, also relates to the question of how we want to define school and what school should do and maybe not do. And out of whether any of these issues should be dealt with in school. It's a provocative question, of course, but in a way, the question that we have to raise is that school have to take into charge some of the shortcomings or even failures of the overall society, not only parents and families in society. I'll just give an example that I think is close to what you said. I learned that in Denmark, they are now learning empathy in school to kids. Is it what we want to do in school? Well, when we see that, we say that's fantastic, but it's also a major failure of the overall social, social link, social interaction. So I think it's a little bit provocative, but I think it also relates to what kind of school do we want for what kind of kids. The second thing is about the method. You presented that as an approach which is interdisciplinary. It is in a way, but I'm also wondering how you take into consideration everything that relates to findings which are not, in a way, quantitatively reachable, or that we cannot grab through quantity. There are a lot of disciplines that are not here and help us really to think about that, about what the child is, how we define child, and thinking of philosophy, of religion thinking, of history, of geography, and so on. So how do you grab these findings which are not quantitative?
D'accord, merci bien. Donc, merci de me donner la parole. Je suis Pafadnam Alidou du Burkina Faso. Bien sûr, à l'IIEP ici. Bon, vraiment, le débat nous a beaucoup intéressés parce qu'on a vu que la présentation faite, c'est une présentation par rapport justement, si vous voulez, au futur qu'il faut définir, plus ou moins. Et par rapport justement au contexte que nous connaissons aujourd'hui, marqué par une grande utilisation des TIC, nous voyons que les enfants, à la limite, ils sont abandonnés face justement aux outils technologiques. Et face justement à cette question, je sais qu'en tant qu'inspecteur de l'enseignement, j'ai fait une recherche sur l'éducation à la citoyenneté. Et là, j'ai découvert quelque part qu'il fallait utiliser en fait d'autres méthodes qu'on utilisait que dans le temps. Parce que les anciennes méthodes ne tiennent plus. Il faut travailler à ce que les enfants puissent de plus en plus avoir la capacité de choisir. Et pour qu'ils aient la capacité de choisir, il faut qu'il y ait de plus en plus une discussion entre les parents et justement les enfants. C'est-à-dire, par exemple, quand il y a un film que l'enfant suit, même si le film comporte des risques, bien sûr, on ne va pas les exposer face aux risques, mais souvent, on n'a pas tout le contrôle de la situation. Et face à cette situation, il faut créer des échanges. Et après ces échanges, des discussions, l'enfant, effectivement, a la possibilité de faire un choix plus raisonnable. Là, effectivement, il peut faire usage de sa raison, une raison qui n'est pas d'ailleurs très mûre d'abord, et très souvent, ils ne sont pas soutenus en fait dans ce sens-là. Si vous voulez, les enfants sont abandonnés. Donc, pour choisir le comportement adéquat, ça devient un problème. Donc, comme l'a dit Sartre, effectivement, nous sentons que nous sommes devenus des dieux avec les technologies, mais véritablement, nous ne sommes pas en mesure d'assumer notre humanité, en d'autres termes. Donc, il faudrait qu'on s'investisse aussi. Quelqu'un a parlé justement des relations plus humaines qu'il faut avoir avec les enfants. Et cet amour peut aider l'enfant à pouvoir comprendre qu'il y a aussi sa part qu'il peut apporter. Et j'étais très content de voir que le futur n'est pas à définir avec une forme de fermeture, mais il faut s'ouvrir parce que l'inconnu peut être plus intéressant. Voilà que les TIC nous ont aidés à sortir d'une impasse pendant qu'on s'inquiétait à un moment donné, selon la présentation que j'ai vue. Merci bien.
Thank you for. I'll just add a little piece on the technology bit and the openness of it all. Since I've been at the game for a while. You know, back in the 90s when I was at the OECD, not in SERI but in the International Futures Program, we did some work on the future of the internet. And you know, the typical concerns, you know, AI is coming, nanotech is coming, biotech is coming. Yeah, you know, it's the latest thing. Okay, so we thought about the internet a little bit, and one of the metaphors of the internet back then was that it opens up new frontiers, that it creates open spaces. Well, we know something about open spaces and power. It's not like we have, you know, this hasn't been something that humanity's faced before. When you create a new territory, people occupy it, and there might not be any rules, and the person with the gun or the, you know, strong, they will dominate. So we need rules. So we need rights. We need due process. We need transparency. These are all things that are pretty straightforward. And, we've been doing this over centuries now, actually. And so when it comes to a lot of these tools that open up and that are essentially symbiotic. I mean, there was another part of this which had to do with, is that we're not driven by our tools. We drive our tools. The tools are extensions of us. We are our tools. And what we do with them depends a lot on the kind of collective choices that we also make. And so one of the things here is that how come we don't all own our privacy? It's doable, it's not hard. The debate we had in 1997, when the OECD had its first conference on the internet, was about encrypting people's data. And guess what? The military said, no, can't do that. Can't encrypt the data because then we can't listen to the bad guys. Okay, but the problem with that, of course, was that meant that only the bad guys were getting the encryptation and that everybody else was open to surveillance. But the real consequence, the profound consequence, is that we couldn't create privacy ourselves. And then there was another step that seemed pretty obvious. If you were going to create encrypted data, so that data you could control, you need to have an identity you could control. But even to this day, you can't identify who you are on the internet. How are we going to stop internet bullying if you can always have a pseudonym? If there's no way to prove who you are, if there's no way to establish your reputation? Is anybody surprised that there's fake news and that there's deception because we haven't introduced cyber citizenship, the right to an identity on the internet that's approvable, ownable, that belongs to you, that you can take responsibility for? But of course, if we did cyber citizenship, there's a little problem there. You know what that is? It's called the nation state. Nation state not too keen on cyber citizens because cyber citizens would be global citizens. And where does that leave the nation state? And the monetary systems and the education systems that are controlled by the nation state. So I just want to point out that the issue of technology and the technology opportunities that are there are very deeply connected with our power structures and the inertia of the existing systems, including the school. So if I can, make a little comment about the school, which I was gently referring to earlier. From my point of view, and I'm pretty much on the record with this on Schools Over and other things, is that the school is a huge, huge obstacle. It really is a serious impediment to adaptation today. And the way in which we care for each other and the way in which learning is organized in our societies, the school is more of a problem than a solution from my point of view. That doesn't mean that that's a very practical observation, because at the moment we're not even thinking about how to radically transform the way learning takes place in our societies. But the observation's, really not a new one. And it's been made from many different perspectives and was made at the beginning of the 20th century by some of the most famous educators. So, I think all of these things are very relevant to this kind of discussion and conversation if we can open it up in that direction.
I'll rise to the defense of schools. I think there is a question around what is the best fit for purpose and how do we modernize schools and sort of try and finish with this conversation, which has been happening since the 70s, actually, or probably even before. And this takes me to actually Hugues' point, because his question is, what is the role of the school? And what should it do? And what is the relative role and responsibility of schools versus parents or families or communities? And that is one of the most fundamental questions we have, I think. And I think that one of the temptations, certainly from a policy perspective, but also from a social perspective, is that school or education more generally will always be called upon to solve all the problems, right? We have poverty. Well, we can educate them. We have, unequal access to opportunity. Well, we can educate them. And what that's doing is kind of pushing problems 20 years down the road. Because, education, it takes some time. And I don't think that that's fair. I think the first question is, what is school responsible for? The well-being of a child, helping deliver a holistic child, any definition of education you want to come up with. It's not about 20 years' time. It's not about some distant future. It's about that particular child's lived experience. And it's about treating that child with respect and letting that child rise and live his or her future. And I think even though on the one hand, there is an argument to say absolutely school is a place of education and everything else is external. On the other hand, we have too many examples of too many inequalities in our systems. And one of the best ways to really give kids access to many equal things, now it's not so much with computers because most people have phones, but 20 years ago, it was one of the few places poor kids could actually access a computer, was in school, because you didn't have to come from a rich family to have that. And previous generations, it was where you could see TV. And so in a way, yeah, it's nice to say, oh, the communities can take care of it, but then you have much more potential inequality because then the families are doing their best, but they're not all equal. And neither are schools, I accept. But I think there is more of an ability to try and intercede and take care of children the way they should be taken care of, to have an equal opportunity through a school than simply saying school's only job is to deliver education and everything else is the responsibility of the family, because that does not help kids who come from a dysfunctional family or who don't have parents, or, it's not their fault, those things. So I do think that is an essential issue that we're not going to solve tonight. It's also a philosophical issue. But I think it's part of a broader conversation. And it's also part of a conversation of how we understand all the different stories that make up what we call evidence. I am an empiricist. I do believe in the power of evidence and the power of research, but I also believe in the power of stories as part of research. And I gave you graphs because they look pretty. But I talked about identity of an adolescent and thinking who you are when you're defining yourself on the internet. And that comes from sociology and philosophy and poetry and youth voices. And so they don't look nice on graphs because they don't make graphs of that, but we can tell those powerful stories. And so we are trying to weave them in, although I take your point that it is a primarily quantitative approach. And just one last comment to our friend from Burkina Faso. I loved your quote. I will translate it into English in case somebody didn't have the headphones on who doesn't speak French, but technology has made us gods. Now we must rediscover our humanity. I thought that was lovely. And I think your point about understanding how to live with technology and think about risks is really part of the mainstream experience of children. And this early approach that we would try and eliminate risk, that we would separate risk from a child's experience, is simply not possible anymore, because almost everyone has one of these things in their pocket. You don't have to be in a major living room with everybody looking at you to access the internet. You could be anywhere. And you have access to all kinds of things that parents can't control, that teachers can't control, that schools can't control. And the best defense for a child is to actually understand what to do with those risks, to recognize them, to identify them, to know who to tell. So it's not about eliminating the risks. It's managing the risks and thinking about digital resilience, because if something bad happens to you, the key is not to just, the key is to be able to keep on going and know that it's not okay and to complain and to say something. And that's something where very early, sort of early models where we would just try and separate that from children, in the end, don't tend to work as well, because they're very vulnerable, actually, if they haven't been taught what to do. So it's a very difficult world, but I take your points and I thank you for those comments as well. Thanks.
So to have fun with it a little bit, the kind of to debate the topic. I mean, mandate creep, the desire to take on more and more is typical of any institution, any organization, actually. Well, who doesn't want to have more to do, more clients, more resources, more this, more that. And it's certainly true that education, I mean, again, somebody who's been around the scene for well over 30 years now, and I think there's going to be a WISE is coming to town, the World Innovation Summit in Education, right? It's coming to Paris next week. I mean, look, let's face it, education's an industry. It's one of the world's biggest industries, along with healthcare and some of the other industries, which are actually smaller. So we have this industry, and it's got to improve its productivity, and it's got to get better, and it's got to create new products, and it's got to do it in a way that's tested by the production side and the consumption side. And we're in the innovation cycle, and we're in the industrial societies that we're in, and so it's normal that education behaves and is treated in this way. But I mean, the thing is that this mandate creep, as tempting as it is, I think that's where I'd like to see the due diligence and the pushback. I mean, I won't. Maybe it's a little bit ostentatious to say speak truth to power, and there I could say the electorate. The voter, the politician who wants to please the voter. But to speak truth to power, in a certain sense, says that, look, schools cannot do these things because they're not structured to do them. They're structured to do certain things very well, but not a lot. Actually, learning things is not one of the best things. I mean, behavior, yes, but actual content, I'm not so sure about. Minimal content, once you're past the basics and reading and writing. Afterwards, it's all about push. And we know that doesn't work. And they hate it. It's boring. It's actually, and boredom is a form of torture. I mean, it's a form of pain. And what are we doing? Well, we know that they're tolerant to boredom. That means they can take a lot of pain. So that means they can have a lousy boss. They can have a boring life. They can put up with being part of industrial society, et cetera, et cetera. Very functional by absolutely, helps things work and helps us get through life. We were born and we die, and we haven't caused too much of a fuss. Thank you very much. But come on, folks. I mean, is that what we're trying to do here? I mean, this is not actually, I mean, if the world seems to be falling apart, which to many, in many ways it does seem, because we're in a transition period, I don't think it's falling apart any more than it was in 39 or 29 or 1848 or whatever. But I mean, if it does seem, it's in part because I think we're not accepting the nature of the reality that we're in. And the question of how to cure ourselves of this impression that our tools give us that we are gods is not one of I mean, well, it's a question of, what does it mean to recapture our humanity? And to recapture our humanity, actually, I think means to realize that, we're part of the physical world. We're part of the animals around us. We're part of and we're part of life and death, and that we're part of complex emergent, and that we need more humility faced with the world that we're living in. That, to me, relieves the school of a whole bunch of things that it's trying to do that it's just not good at doing. And that we can try and gear up our policies, which I've been watching for 30 years. Let's make it, let's train the teachers more. Let's do this. Let's do that. Let's change the curriculum. Let's redefine the skills. More and more. And yet, we're just trying to fix things. This is a solution-oriented approach to the world. And the really critical question is, why do we think the problems are the same?
Thank you very much, Riel and Tracy. Do we have more questions? We can have I can see quite a number of fingers. I think Jordan is up there. Would you like to take the second question? And you have the third, and hopefully we have another round, huh?
Good afternoon. I'm Jordan Naidu from UNESCO. I was quite intrigued by even the title of 21st Century Children, and rather than children in the 21st century, because this, begs the question, has the concept of childhood and children, the way we define, evolved over time? Because I'm reminded of Philip Airy's book on the history of childhood, where he actually claims that pre-Middle Ages, the concept of childhood did not exist. It's contested. Many people disagree with that. It doesn't mean that people before the Middle Ages did not love children, but the fact as a category of person, it did not exist. And I think this is something we need to relook at. Has technology even redefined? I'm thinking of, you spoke of governance. Should we be asking the question, do we have to rewrite the CRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, taking into account change over time? So there are a number of questions just in terms of the concept of childhood that is intriguing in terms of the way you are defining the study. That's one question. But I have many more, but I want to pose another question from the perspective. You asked us to look at it from the perspective, these are OECD countries. I think there's some assumption that culture and social norms are homogenous across these, 50 countries or whatever the number, but they are quite different. Even taking North America and Canada, and the politics of the region today demonstrate that even more. So I think we have to be very careful about some of the generalizations across those 4 categories. It's really, I think, a bit concerning in a way. But I want to go back. You asked the question, how does this apply perhaps to UNESCO countries, developing or whatever name we want to call those countries, low income or whatever. One question for me in relation to early childhood development and care is that many agencies, NGOs push the question of parenting education. And I think sometimes the notion of parenting education in the developing context can be quite condescending and patronizing. I would raise the same question, given what you've said about the changes in responsibilities and the way parenting should occur, given technology, whatever other conditions. Should we also say that every parent needs some form of parenting education? Because we assume, everybody who's been to school assumes that they can teach. In the same way, we are all expected to be good parents regardless, without any training. So that's my question. Do we need parenting education for all?
Hi, everybody, and my name is Yoni Pali. I'm a user experience consultant in innovation, so I'm helping organization with these fancy tools like design thinking, etc. First, I can say that I'm a bit puzzled because with the title "Education for 21st Century Children," I thought that we were talking more about schools. But as you remind us, actually, education encompasses schools, exactly. But also, what I wanted to just to talk with you is like I read that in a survey, and that 47% of the current jobs of today are going to disappear in 2025. This is the Oxford University that launched this survey. So for me, it's like a big question mark, really, about education / schools. Like, okay, so this is in evidence, actually, I think that governments are really ignoring these facts. Today, because 25 years is coming very, very, very quickly, and or ignoring these facts. So, well, we were talking about the role of the schools before, but I want just to point out also that maybe the kids today are not that innocent that we thought. You were talking about their ability to create their own, to create content with social media, for instance, and to create also their own job, for instance, and their own circle of friends, of peers. And this is something really interesting and intelligent from them that today's school cannot actually teach. And maybe this is this paradigm shift that needs to be really highlighted. Okay, today, the school is not able to train for this type of job, but maybe we need to train about a posture, a position, because we know that these kids today will have different career. So how to, for instance, pivot, how to learn empowerment, how to learn leadership, how to do networks, why not planning some mentoring, for instance, for people that we look up to. So this is something that needs maybe to be embedded in education/schools, and not only to have like this linear thing that, okay, when you do, for instance, in France, scientific studies, you're going to be like a doctor, engineer, etc. But be more transversal. Okay, this is good for me.
Thank you. Bonjour, merci beaucoup pour cette conférence. Je suis Aïcha Sarakalis, fondatrice du cabinet Qualitas pour la prévention contre l'échec scolaire. Et je suis très heureuse de voir Madame Aïcha Ba parce que c'était ma responsable quand j'étais à l'UNESCO. quelques expériences extraordinaires et merveilleuses. J'ai deux questions. La première, nous sommes à l'Institut international de la planification de l'éducation. Et le mot ministère de l'éducation me dérange beaucoup parce qu'on devait l'appeler ministère de l'instruction. L'éducation, c'est la famille. L'instruction, c'est l'État, on va dire. Nous avons besoin de deux choses. D'abord, le mot technologie me rappelle le mot mise à jour. Nous avons tous, vous l'avez dit, les portables. Et à chaque fois qu'on a une application qui marche pas très bien, elles nous disent mise à jour, sinon on peut pas avancer. Nous avons besoin d'une mise à jour pour les parents, la relation entre les parents et l'école, et la relation entre les enseignants, la formation des enseignants et les nouvelles technologies. Il y a un réel besoin pour avancer au XXIe siècle. Nous sommes au début du XXIe siècle, c'est pas encore fini. Donc, j'aurais aimé entendre l'éducation pour le début du XXIe siècle. Mais je suis très heureuse d'apprendre qu'en neurosciences affectives et sociales et en neurosciences en général et en sciences d'éducation, en psychologie de développement, en psychologie cognitive, nous avons de l'espoir. Notre cerveau est plastique. Il va nous donner beaucoup de changements. D'où je rejoins monsieur qui a parlé de l'empathie tout à l'heure. Je suis vraiment une vraie, défenseuse de l'empathie, parce que nous avons énormément de résultats, quand l'environnement de l'enfant est plein d'empathie et de bienveillance, on apprend bien, on est bien élevé et le cerveau se développe merveilleusement. Effectivement, comme vous le dites tout à l'heure, à propos de vos petits-enfants, l'enfant ne réagit pas jusqu'à l'âge de raison, on va dire à 7 ans, donc il explore le monde. Et ça me rappelle une très belle phrase de Piaget, qui était le professeur de mon professeur, et qui a dit une très belle phrase: l'enfant arrive au monde, il a un projet, comprendre le monde. Comment aider nos enfants, nos élèves et nos enseignants à comprendre notre monde actuel?
I think you have a good set of questions here, quite challenging. Who wants to start? Tracy this time or Nariel? Yeah, whoever.
Let me just tell a little story, and I think it kind of covers off most of these things, which is that one of the things that I do, which has to do with futures literacy, in other words, understanding how we use the future, which really means how do we use our imagination, because the future is only imaginary, was an exercise we did in Sierra Leone, in Freetown, with young people, young adults. And we asked them, what does it mean to become an adult? What's the transition from youth to adulthood? And what we discovered through a process, which I won't go and explain, but it was an emotive, it was an expressive, it was a holistic process of inviting the participants to create knowledge together, collective intelligence, knowledge creation, was that the definition of adulthood for them was completely different from the definition that we were using for policy purposes, which had to do with age and certain thresholds and certain milestones. And I think that the challenge from the point of view of both research but also policy which does not need to be bounded by the existing instruments, the existing institutions, but can actually question whether the existing institutions serve good policy, is to really begin to open up some of these key concepts, and to not accept them as something that's universal. So let me undermine, in some senses, one of the fundamental epistemological foundations of my education and my working life at the OECD, at UNESCO, which is our effort to understand things on the basis of common denominators is catastrophic, because the meaning is not a common denominator. The meaning is the experience in the moment now, the ephemeral, actually. And the ephemeral has incredible significance, because after what you've experienced here and now today, at this moment, you can never be the same. In other words, you didn't do something else. You didn't go on that other universe. You went on this one. And therefore, everything that happens in the present is incredibly powerful in the present. Its implications in the future, I don't know. They could be good, they could be bad. But the key here is to recapture our ability to understand and to explore the ephemeral, the improvisational, the spontaneous, the now. Being, not just becoming, to go back to Sartre. And that, it seems to me, is one of the key issues in front of us today, on the basis of all your questions, because whether it's jobs that disappear, they've always disappeared. Preparing for jobs has always failed. I've now gone through, in my career, I've gone through 6 cycles of trying to predict what the new jobs will be, because the old jobs are disappearing, and how can we prepare for them? And every time we fail, because that's not the way it works. It's an emergent property. You cannot know in advance. It's unknowable. So, these are the questions. Either we're going to say it's unknowable, because that's what social science, physical science, and our understanding of complexity tells us, but we're going to ignore that, and we're going to pretend that we can know, and we're going to act as if we can be so brilliant that we will be able to predict and to colonize and to determine the future, or we change our framework and we stop trying to know the future and we stop trying to control it, and we become much more comfortable with emergence and ephemerality and being, not just becoming. So, I mean, I think that kind of speaks to the 3 topics there.
Okay.
I'm feeling quite comfortable with complex emerging challenges, thanks to you. I want to go back to the story of helicopter parenting. When I asked my team, do you have a translation for this in your language? It was a genuine question. I thought, well, I speak English and French, grew up in Quebec. Maybe it's just the 2 places I know, could be. And then the speed with which that paper filled up was amazing. And it, for me, brought home the reminder that although it's important to remember the differences and remember the contexts and remember the ways we're all different, it's also amazingly powerful to find the things we share. And it's one of the things that I find really joyful about working in an international environment is when you get a group of people from very different places around the table and everybody knows exactly what you're talking about because they can all see it in their own lived experience. And so there is it's a tension. You won't always have everything shared and you can't always be very specific. But I think it's really important and powerful to remember that. It's powerful to remember that if we want to think of children and their own identities online, they might resonate more with somebody who lives across the world than their neighbor on the same floor of their apartment building. Because we are who we are, and who we resonate with and what speaks to us is very individual, but also very shared. And one of the things I want to come back to is thinking about, what does this mean to be context specific, or how do we actually understand these 21st century children? Have things really changed? I mean, on the one hand, no, because we know that these have been concerns actually for many, many years. On the other hand, the one really big thing is technology, which is a pretty big game changer, actually. Not for relationships, not for people necessarily, but for how we live our lives and what we do and what we do in our day to day. But the other thing I want to remind us is that when we say 21st century children, that is an enormously disparate group of people. And if we want to just think about technology for a second, you know, you've got the 13-year-old who's creating and uploading great content, but you've also got the 13-year-old who's like, oh, I want to read my book. And both are okay, right? That's their reality. And some, you know, we this for when, do you remember there was this digital natives? There was a huge push. It was everybody, all these kids were growing up with computers and they were becoming digital natives and their brain was changing, physiologically changing because they had grown up with computers. Turned out that wasn't the case. Brains are still brains. But it also turned out that some kids, I mean, they are amazing. They can do things that they do need to teach their teachers because the teachers will never be as good as them. But then there are also kids who are exactly the same age and they kind of use the computer the same way I do. And it's not that there's a failure. I mean, I think it's just important to remember that kids are not one unified mass, and a generation of people, even from the same context, even in the same classroom, is going to contain very many individuals, and all of their lived experiences are equally valid. And so when we think about the future and we think about what we can control and what we can't, all we can do is sort of do the best we can. I do think your argument about flexibility, adaptability, being able to move and change and understand what will be important and having the confidence in yourself to continue to believe in your ability to grow and evolve is what's important. And I think that's probably the biggest gift we can give our children, whether it's from the family or from a school or ideally both. Because at the end of the day, you know, kids who are in school now, our youngest 21st century children are 19. And so they're not so young anymore. And I'm excited to see what they will do because I actually think there's a great world out there and I'm excited to be surprised by them.
Thank you very much. We have also some questions from our online community, some 900 people out there. So quite a number of people are following our stream. There's a question on the relationship between institutional characteristics of educational systems and how they relate to habits and behaviors of children towards technology. So is there a relationship between the characteristics of educational systems and how children relate to technology? That's the first question. And then we have a question about a comment. We must certainly develop children's emotional, social, technological, manual, artistic, critical, and creative capabilities. Any examples of emerging standards, contents, assessment material? So that was the question about measurements of all these very important things that we often find difficult to measure. And then there's a third question. To what extent does socioeconomic status have an influence on your research? I suppose to what extent is it a variable in your research? Huh? Well, perhaps there are lots of questions to you, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot that can be debated, but I'll try and answer these relatively succinctly because I know there's a lot of questions also. To be very straightforward and go with the last one first, socioeconomic status is huge, actually. It's far more important than many other distinctions, and very advantaged children in one country have more in common with very advantaged children in another country than they do with their own compatriots. It's something we want to work more on. We have been using averages, and so it's a powerful way to tell a story, but there's a lot of hidden stories under there. And the reality of a 21st century children who is from a poor family is very different than someone from a middle class or a well-to-do family, even within the same city. So that's something we will be looking at actually in this year because it's huge. In terms of assessment material, I mean, that's actually one of the huge questions at the OECD, I imagine also at UNESCO. What's the best way to think about how we want to assess this in education? Do we want to assess it in education? You know, there's pros and cons. If you don't assess it, then maybe it is ignored. If you do assess it, maybe it is changed because then people want to force it to go in a certain way. play is a great example. Do you want to assess play? No. But at the same time, play has been pushed to the side because it's not considered as important. So these are hard questions, but there's actually some really interesting work on new forms of assessment for socio and emotional skills, for example, or for collaboration, problem solving, critical thinking, creativity. Those things are all being developed and will be part of upcoming PISA tests, for example, as well as many other of our materials. And just lastly, systems and technology. It's an interesting question, and I imagine that there probably are impacts on technology use by way systems are structured. But I actually think the biggest impact on technology use for children is their friends. So regardless of their education system, most of their time spent online is outside of the school. And most of what they learn is actually the people, either their friends online or their real friends, their face-to-face friends, or those are sometimes the same people. And I think that's a really powerful influencer that we actually don't harness enough when we think about the power of education. And I think we can't forget that. I mean, now your phone goes with you into your room. And so it's 24 hours a day sometimes with you. And it will have far more of an effect on your life than those few hours at school. So that's something I think we can't forget.
Yeah, I mean, just a little comment about this, okay, so I take my tool off. Yeah, it really changes my life, huh? Really changes my life, right? Okay, put my tool back on and I get to see you guys. This relationship between us and our tools, like eating cooked food because we have fire, these things are really, really basic and fundamental. And I think one of the things that the institutions tends to do, and I think, AI nervousness and Facebook nervousness and all this objectification, which is part of a deterministic engineering perspective on reality, that we can control it, that we can understand all the causality, etc. That whole framework, again, falsifies our relationship to our tools. And it's not that the institutions, are malevolent or negative, but I think it's deeply embedded in the fabric of almost everything we do, including our institutions, to create a divide between us and our tools in ways which relate to this issue of us playing God because it makes us feel powerful. But I think that we're going to have a very hard time coming to grips with all these things if we stay within those kinds of paradigms. And it's not that I'm saying that there's only one paradigm. I don't want to be saying that at all. But if we can't diversify the perspectives that we take on the basis of moving outside of one paradigm, I think we're very limited. And of course the world's scary, because if you have to explore the world, but you're very limited, it's hard. And then if you think you've explored the world and now you know it, that's also really crazy, because that's not true either. So we need to be able to I think move along in the way we think about these things in order to escape the kind of pressure that institutions and peers and others place on us, because we think we need to master the tools, or that the tools are mastering us, etc. So I mean, I think there's really significant transitional problems from the point of view of the way we see the world in order for us to move forward on all these topics. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave you because I have a train to catch. So I'm very sorry to have to run off at the end of this fascinating conversation. And I wanted to thank to Tracy and Michaela for a very wonderful gathering and for the questions we've had. And my apologies, but the Eurostar is waiting.
I will close the conversation. So then in this case, I think I want to close the conversation. I think we had a fascinating conversation. On the one hand, all these very interesting trends that we are confronted with as educators, also as policymakers, some of us. Perhaps also from you real some inputs, on how we think about things, how we approach problems. I think it's very interesting to keep that in mind. Perhaps some messages I think that I take from the conversation. I think the first one is really about really the basic approach, adapting education systems to the realities of the child and to the diversity of the children and to their different needs, and remaining open to what's coming up and what is changing. I think that's really something which I think is a very important point. And the second one that came up in your presentation, and relates a lot to our debate. I mean, how are we dealing, who is responsible for what, and how are we dealing actually with the mandate of schools, and the importance of creating partnerships and bringing in expertise from the outside. I mean, the school cannot deal with everything, but the school will have to deal with the problems in one way or the other. So I think we have to think about solutions to the upcoming challenges. And the third one, I think it's a very important one, what you said. I think the future lies in our understanding of the present. And I think perhaps there we have to do a little bit more of thinking, and our capacity to react to instantaneous challenges. I think that's something that we have to keep in mind in our multiple roles as human beings, as professionals, as parents, as whatever. So I think it's a fundamental principle, I think, that should guide us, I think, and I want to highlight this really as an important conclusion in our debate. So thank you very much, both of you. I think a clap to both speakers. A great thanks to our interpreters. They, I'm sure, did a wonderful job. And also, I would like to mention that the conversation can go on about challenges of 21st century children, because we have a cocktail waiting for us, a small cocktail waiting for us in our basement, so we can continue our conversation. Thank you very much.